Historical context is very important to consider when analysing any work of fiction. After all, context is what gives meaning to a text in the first place. This applies when thinking about budgetary limitations in TV shows or other factors that would have influenced the production, but it is also true when discussing the moral themes and values expressed in a piece of media, since they also change over time. That being said though, you do have to tread carefully, particularly when discussing the portrayal of marginalised groups, because there is a certain point at which historical context ironically becomes historical revisionism, and that's going to be the focus of today's video. So this all came about because I was recently watching a video from Benjamin at the Whoniversals discussing the Doctor Who serial The Savages, where he argues that the use of blackface in the story is a product of its time, and then proceeds to go on a long ramble about societal racism in the 1960s, even going on to say we shouldn't think less of William Hartnell for his bigotry because that's just how most people were back then. The whole section is littered with qualifiers, essentially softening and shifting responsibility away from individuals for their racist views. Now, the intention of this video essay is not to bash the Whoniversals. Benjamin's video is actually pretty insightful for the most part, making the point that The Savages is actually ahead of its time, ironically, in terms of its anti-racist and colonialist themes, and is only really let down by its production. I'll put the link in the description for those who are interested. But I want to use it as a jumping off point to really interrogate this notion that it was a different time and that racism was acceptable back then, because this line of discourse is one which crops up a lot, not just with racism, but also with regard to misogyny, homophobia, and other problematic themes in historical media, and all too often it is used as a deflection. Hell, even Philip and Adam were guilty of this on the Everybody's Dead Dave podcast when discussing Red Dwarf, a show which repeatedly depicts non-consensual acts against women as a joke. But if you want a more mainstream example, look no further than the discourse surrounding the film Gone with the Wind, which has become notorious for its uncritical and arguably somewhat glorified portrayal of slavery and white supremacist Confederate values. What is often overlooked though is that Gone with the Wind was controversial even at the time of its release back in 1939, and that shouldn't really come as too much of a surprise since, you know, black people existed back then and they had opinions about stuff. That's why we had the civil rights movement. It's also why women's suffrage happened and later on the Stonewall riots. What it ultimately comes down to is marginalised groups being ignored or talked over by straight white guys who think they know better. And honestly, the more things change, the more they stay the same. It just so happens that in the 1930s, along with subsequent decades, it was those same straight white guys who were disproportionately responsible for the creation of all Western media and TV shows, leading to things like blackface becoming quote-unquote normalised when they never should have been. Now, in the most literal sense, the statement that things were different back then is not untrue. Racism and homophobia were not only institutionalised, but it was not uncommon for your average person on the street to hold those kind of bigoted views, and from a historical perspective, that is something which should be acknowledged. Returning to Doctor Who for a moment, the episode Human Nature and the Family of Blood actually offers a good critical insight into the systematic nature of racism that existed in pre-war Britain. Strangely, a few people have labelled this story as racist, despite the fact that Joanne Redfern, one of its main protagonists, gets directly and quite rightly called out for her bigotry. This is because for the most part the character of Joanne is portrayed as sympathetic, even having a romantic relationship with the Doctor's human counterpart John Smith. But the reality is, in the 1910s, people could be racist despite coming across as perfectly decent and reasonable in every other way. The problem arises when that fact starts being used as a crutch or an excuse, because here's the thing, when it comes to the subject of racism in media or racism in any other context, the only opinion that matters is that of people of colour. What white people had to say about it at the time is irrelevant. Same goes with homophobia, misogyny and the like. Depressing as it is, you could probably say that it's a fairly commonly held societal view today that transgender people are a threat to cis people and are mentally ill and shouldn't be allowed to occupy the same spaces or have the same rights, etc. But all of that is irrelevant because trans people are here and they are speaking, and I'm sure most of them would be insulted to think that in another 50 years today's transphobia will be dismissed and excused on account of the fact that it was a different time and that's how everyone thought back then. In fact, if you are one of my trans viewers, let me know in the comments what you would think about that. The point is that even when taking into account that societal morals are subjective and ever-changing, bigotry is never acceptable and never was acceptable, and it's important to think critically about the media we consume no matter what decade it is from. And that doesn't necessarily mean dismissing every problematic work as having no value or merit whatsoever. I still consider myself a fan of Red Dwarf, but at the same time I will fully acknowledge that Series 8 is a toxic dumpster fire and Doug Naylor will never get a free pass for that just because he co-created something that I enjoy. There's a reason I made reference in this video to content creators who I follow and actually have quite a lot of respect for, and it's to illustrate that while misguided, the things were different back then rhetoric doesn't necessarily always come from a place of deep-seated bigotry. I think a lot of the time it has more to do with the fact we are very protective of the media we grew up with or formed a close attachment to, and we don't like having to confront the fact that aspects of it may be racist or misogynistic and that our enjoyment of it might therefore say something about ourselves. But introspection is healthy, and while it may be more convenient to just say, oh, well it was a product of its time, therefore I don't have to think critically about those problematic elements, to do so is extremely reductive, and crucially it elevates the voices of people whose opinion should not matter above those whose opinion does matter, and that is not okay. I'm Midnight, and I just lost my train of thought. If you would like to support this channel, then head over to my eBay store Cult Coven, where I sell books, media, and other nerdy things. Send a message with your order and you can also get a shout out in an upcoming video. Thank you.